When Leonardo da Vinci picked up a brush, he saw something no one else could see. Not the subject, not the canvas. He saw the air itself. Picture what happens when morning mist rises from a Tuscan valley at dawn. Every edge softens. Distant hills blur into sky. That's what Leonardo learned to paint. And in doing so, he created the most famous smile in human history. But here's the thing about revolution. It rarely announces itself with trumpets. Leonardo's transformation of Western art began not with grand proclamations, but with quiet observation. He spent hours watching smoke curl from candles in his dimly lit workshop. He studied how faces looked different in shadow versus harsh noon light. What he discovered would change everything. The Italian word sfumato comes from fumo, smoke. Leonardo used it to describe a painting technique where colors and tones blend into one another without harsh lines or borders. Imagine trying to define exactly where smoke ends and air begins. You cannot. That impossibility became Leonardo's obsession. Before Sfumato, painting had a fundamental problem. Artists outlined their subjects with clear, dark lines, then filled in the colors like children completing a coloring book. The results looked flat and lifeless. Figures seemed pasted onto backgrounds like paper cutouts. Even the greatest masters of the early Renaissance, Botticelli, Perugino, Verrocchio, created works that, while beautiful, lacked something essential. They lacked breath. Leonardo saw this limitation as a young apprentice in Andrea del Verrocchio's Florence workshop during the 1460s and 70s. He watched his master paint angels and Madonnas with exquisite technical skill. Yet something troubled the young Leonardo deeply. When he looked at real faces, at real hands, at real landscapes, he saw no outlines anywhere. Nature drew nothing with pen and ink. So why should painters? This question haunted him through his teenage years and into his 20s. He began experimenting obsessively. Instead of outlining a figure and filling it in, he built up thin layers of translucent paint. Each layer added imperceptible depth. Each layer softened the edges between light and shadow just slightly more than the one before. The results were unlike anything Florence had ever seen. Have you ever tried to describe exactly where a shadow begins on someone's face? The exercise seems simple until you actually attempt it. There is no clear line you can point to and say, here is where light ends and darkness begins. Light graduates into darkness through infinite subtle gradations that our eyes perceive, but our words struggle to capture. Leonardo understood this truth before anyone else. He captured these gradations by applying sometimes 30 or 40 layers of paint, each so thin you could see through it like colored glass. His brushwork became invisible. When other painters examined his canvases up close, they searched desperately for brushstrokes. They found none. The paint seemed to have materialized on the surface through some kind of mysterious sorcery. Leonardo revealed nothing about his painstaking methods. He let rivals and admirers wonder while he continued perfecting his secret technique. The technique demanded something unprecedented in Renaissance workshops: patience. Consider what this meant in practical terms for an artist trying to earn a living. Each layer needed to dry completely before the next could be applied. Some layers took days to dry properly. Some took weeks depending on humidity and temperature. Leonardo's oil paints, which he mixed himself according to jealously guarded formulas he recorded in mirror writing, required specific atmospheric conditions. A painting that another master might complete in 3 or 4 months would occupy Leonardo for years, sometimes decades. This perfectionism would define his entire career, bringing him both immortality and profound frustration. Patrons across Italy learned that commissioning Leonardo meant accepting radical uncertainty about when, or whether, he would actually deliver the finished work. The man simply would not be rushed by contracts or threats or pleading. He painted when the light was right, when his mood aligned properly. when the paint had dried to exactly the correct consistency for the next layer. And often, he did not paint at all. He would stand before a work for hours at a time, studying it with fierce concentration, adding nothing. Other times, he would make a single careful brushstroke and then leave for the day. His assistants and apprentices learned not to question these seemingly strange habits. The master worked according to internal rhythms only he understood. What was happening during those long hours of staring? Leonardo was seeing what others could not see. He was watching how light fell across forms. He was observing how colors changed depending on what colors surrounded them. He was calculating which areas needed another glaze and which had achieved the precise effect he sought. His apparent idleness was actually the most intense form of creative labor. The Virgin of the Rocks announced Leonardo's revolutionary vision to the world with unmistakable force. Commissioned in 1483 by the Confraternity of the Immaculate Conception in Milan, it should have been a straightforward religious painting. The detailed contract specified exact dimensions, required subjects, and a firm deadline for completion. Leonardo ignored most of it. What emerged from his studio after years of work challenged every assumption about religious art that his contemporaries held dear. The Virgin Mary sits in a mysterious rocky grotto. Dramatic geological formations rising around her, like the pillars of some primordial cathedral carved by nature rather than human hands. The infant Jesus blesses the young John the Baptist, while an enigmatic angel points toward the sacred scene, looking directly at us with an expression that seems to hold secrets. All of this sounds conventional enough for a religious commission. But look closer. Where are the halos? Previous artists had always crowned holy figures with golden circles announcing their divine sanctity to viewers. These halos served as visual labels, ensuring that even illiterate peasants could identify which figures were sacred. Leonardo painted none. His Holy Family appears entirely human, illuminated not by supernatural glow but by the soft, natural light filtering through the rocky grotto from some unseen source above. Divinity, he seemed to suggest, needed no advertisement. The composition itself broke new ground in ways that would influence every ambitious painter who came after. Leonardo arranged his figures in a pyramidal structure, with Mary's head at the apex and the children and angel forming the stable base. This geometric organization would become absolutely standard in high Renaissance painting. But in 1483, it shocked viewers accustomed to more crowded, less structured arrangements where figures competed for attention. Why does this matter to you? Centuries later, in a world of digital images and artificial intelligence. Because Leonardo was doing something that artists and designers still struggle with today. He was asking how to create convincing depth on a flat surface, how to make painted figures seem to breathe and exist in real space, how to capture not just how things look, but how they feel to experience. These questions have not been answered definitively even now. The rocks themselves demonstrate Leonardo's extraordinary geological knowledge. He had spent years climbing through the Italian Alps with his sketchbook, recording stone formations with scientific precision, studying how water carved caverns over millennia of patient erosion. The grotto in Virgin of the Rocks is not generic background filler. It is a specific, believable place rendered with the accuracy of geological illustration. Yet the scene remains dreamlike. This tension between scientific precision and poetic mystery defines Sfumato at its deepest level. Leonardo painted every rock with geological truthfulness while bathing the entire scene in soft, uncertain light that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere. The combination creates an otherworldly atmosphere that no previous artist had achieved or even imagined possible. The confraternity was thoroughly confused. They had expected a conventional altarpiece celebrating their religious devotion. They received something strange and unprecedented that seemed to follow its own mysterious logic rather than their careful specifications. Disputes over payment dragged on for years. filling notarized documents with complaints and counter-complaints. Leonardo eventually painted a second version, now in London's National Gallery, while the original remained with him until he sold it separately. Both versions survive today, allowing us to track his evolving technique across a quarter-century of refinement. The London version, completed around 1508, shows even more sophisticated sfumato than the original. The faces have softened further into living presences. The transitions between light and shadow have become impossibly subtle, defying analysis even with modern technology. Leonardo had spent 25 years perfecting what was already revolutionary when he first painted it. How many modern creators would dedicate a quarter century to refining a single technique? This question sits at the heart of Leonardo's enduring legacy. His obsessive perfectionism produced some of history's greatest artistic achievements. It also produced frustration, unfinished projects, broken contracts, and professional difficulties that haunted him throughout his career. The same psychological trait that enabled Sfumato's breakthrough made him unreliable by conventional commercial standards. You might recognize this tension in contemporary terms. Think of tech founders who delay product launches seeking perfection while competitors ship imperfect but functional alternatives. Think of musicians who spend years on albums that might have been released in months, polishing and repolishing until the record label forces them to stop. Think of writers who revise endlessly, never quite satisfied with any sentence. Leonardo pioneered a creative approach that balances brilliance against practicality, often unsuccessfully from a business perspective. The Last Supper represents both the triumph and tragedy of this approach in its most dramatic form. Duke Ludovico Sforza of Milan commissioned the work for the refectory of Santa Maria del Grazi in 1495. Leonardo was to paint Christ's final meal with his apostles on the monastery's dining hall wall. The concept held profound meaning for its intended audience. Dominican monks eating their humble suppers would look up from their simple food and see the moment Jesus announced his betrayal, transforming every meal into an echo of sacred history. The concept inspired Leonardo's most innovative composition. Traditional Last Supper paintings spread the apostles evenly along one side of the table, each figure isolated and static, all facing outward toward viewers like actors taking a curtain call. Only Judas sat on the opposite side of the table, segregated to identify him as the betrayer. These were clear compositions, visually legible in their theological messaging but emotionally lifeless. Leonardo reimagined the scene entirely. He chose to depict the precise dramatic moment when Jesus says, "One of you will betray me." Every apostle reacts differently to this devastating announcement. Shock, denial, grief, suspicion, confusion, protest. The emotional drama explodes across the wall in waves of psychological intensity radiating outward from Christ's calm center. Have you ever watched a group receive unexpected, devastating news? Some lean forward urgently, desperate for more information. Others pull back in denial, as if physical distance could protect them from truth. Hands gesture wildly, mouths open in mid-exclamation. Some freeze while others erupt. Leonardo captured this chaos of human reaction while imposing geometric order that contains and shapes the emotional turbulence. He grouped the 12 apostles into 4 clusters of 3. Each group forms its own contained mini-drama while contributing to the larger compositional rhythm. On Christ's immediate left, 3 figures lean toward him, seeking clarification or protesting their innocence. Another cluster recoils in visible shock. On his right, apostles turn to each other in confused consultation, while the final group seems frozen, still processing the impossible announcement. Jesus sits alone at the center, calm amid the storm he has created. The perspective draws every eye irresistibly to Christ. Leonardo calculated the vanishing point with mathematical precision, placing it exactly at Jesus' right temple, all the architectural lines, the receding walls, the coffered ceiling, the tapestries hanging behind the table, converge on this single spot. The effect is subtle, but extraordinarily powerful. Viewers feel pulled toward Christ even before they consciously understand why their attention keeps returning to that serene face. The light itself tells the story with theological eloquence. 3 windows behind Jesus create a bright halo effect around his head without Leonardo painting any explicitly supernatural glow. The light seems entirely natural. Afternoon sun streaming through monastery windows. Yet it performs the same symbolic function as those gold circles he had rejected in Virgin of the Rocks. Once again, he achieved religious meaning through careful observation of natural phenomena rather than relying on conventional symbolic shortcuts. Then came the tragedy. Traditional fresco painting requires working quickly against inflexible deadlines imposed by chemistry rather than patrons. Artists apply wet lime plaster to a wall section, then paint directly into it before it dries and hardens. The pigments bond chemically with the calcium carbide, creating durable images that can last centuries if protected from moisture. Countless frescoes from the medieval period survive today in remarkable condition. Leonardo hated this technique. Why would he reject something so proven and durable? Because fresco did not allow for sfumato. Wet plaster dries too quickly for the thin, translucent layers that created his signature luminous style. You cannot apply 40 careful glazes to a surface that becomes permanently set in hours. Fresco demanded quick, decisive, unrevised brushwork, the exact opposite of Leonardo's slow, meditative, endlessly refined approach. He could not bear to sacrifice his effects for durability. So he invented something new. Instead of true fresco, Leonardo applied his oil paints to a dry wall that he had prepared with an experimental ground layer of his own devising. This gesso-like preparation would, he believed, accept oil paint and allow him to work slowly, build up translucent layers, and achieve the soft atmospheric gradations that fresco made impossible. The technique seemed to succeed brilliantly in the short term. The Last Supper emerged as his unquestioned masterpiece. Visitors from across Italy gasped at the emotional intensity, the psychological depth they had never seen in any painting. The response of each apostle to betrayal felt unprecedented in its specificity and truth. Judas, clutching his money bag in guilty reflex, recoils into shadow while the others gesture and exclaim their innocence. Peter's hand grips a knife, foreshadowing his violent defense of Jesus in Gethsemane. Young John seems almost to faint with grief, leaning away as if the words have struck him physically. Critics declared it the greatest painting in Italy, perhaps in all of Europe. Then it started falling apart. Within 20 years of completion, observers reported that the paint was already flaking from the wall. The experimental ground layer had failed to bond properly with the damp stone. Moisture seeped through continuously from the monastery kitchen located directly behind the refectory wall. By 1556, one visiting writer described the once magnificent work as a muddle of blots, barely recognizable as a coherent image. Leonardo's perfectionism had created a beautiful time bomb. Can you imagine watching your life's greatest work crumble while you still lived? Leonardo heard reports of the deterioration before his death in 1519, the painting he had labored over for 3 years. The work that proved Sfumato could achieve emotional intensity beyond any traditional technique, was visibly dissolving year by year. The very innovations that made it unprecedented also ensured its destruction. Over subsequent centuries, well-meaning restorers made things progressively worse. They repainted damaged sections according to their own era's styles and tastes. They applied varnishes that yellowed and cracked within decades. They filled in gaps with their own interpretations of what Leonardo might have painted. By the 20th century, barely any original paint remained visible beneath layers of accumulated restoration attempts. The Last Supper had become a ghost of itself, a palimpsest of failed preservation efforts layered over Leonardo's vanishing vision. Only modern restoration technology, applied between 1977 and 1999, 22 years of painstaking work, revealed what actually remained of the original. Restorers used microscopic analysis, careful solvents, and infinite patience to remove centuries of overpainting and uncover Leonardo's surviving brushwork beneath. What they found confirmed both his genius and his recklessness. The original Sfumato, where it survived, was breathtaking. The subtle gradations exceeded even what contemporary copies had suggested. Colors that restorers expected to find had layers of complexity that no copyist had captured. But so little original paint survived that the restoration raised profound philosophical questions. How much of a work must remain for it to be considered authentic? What do we actually value? The physical object itself or the idea it represents? These questions would recur with Leonardo's other experimental failures. Meanwhile, during these years in Milan and Florence, his rivalry with Michelangelo Buonarroti was intensifying into open hostility. The two greatest artists of their age genuinely despised each other. Michelangelo, 23 years younger than Leonardo, represented everything the older master was not: quick, decisive, relentlessly focused on the human body above all other subjects. Where Leonardo dispersed his restless energy across painting, sculpture, engineering, anatomy, botany, and dozens of other intellectual pursuits. Michelangelo drove with single-minded intensity toward sculptural perfection. He completed projects. He delivered on time. He worked fast. Their philosophical differences ran deep. Leonardo believed art should emerge from careful observation of nature and scientific understanding of how things actually work. Michelangelo believed ideal forms existed in the artist's imagination and needed only to be released from imprisoning stone. Leonardo built up slowly from observation. Michelangelo carved away everything that was not the vision. Their confrontation came in 1504. The government of Florence commissioned both artists to paint enormous battle scenes for the Hall of the 500 in the Palazzo Vecchio, the seat of Republican government. Leonardo would depict the Battle of Anghiari, a Florentine cavalry victory from 1440. Michelangelo would show the Battle of Cassina, another military triumph, for the first and only time. The two geniuses would compete directly on the same walls for undisputed supremacy. What might you have given to witness this contest? The artistic community of Florence buzzed with anticipation for months. Young painters and apprentices took sides, debating their masters' merits in workshops and taverns. Everyone who cared about art understood that the winner of this contest would claim undisputed leadership of Italian painting for a generation. Leonardo began characteristically slowly. He spent months on preparatory drawings, studying horses in violent motion, sketching soldiers locked in desperate combat. His surviving studies show warriors' faces contorted with battle fury and terror. Horses rear and bite each other's necks. Bodies tangle in chaotic violence that seems to burst from the paper. The composition would have been the most dynamic, large-scale work of his career. A vision of war's horror that matched any modern documentation of combat. Then he made another experimental mistake. For the actual painting on the wall, Leonardo decided to try encaustic, an ancient technique using heated wax mixed with pigments that he had read about in classical Roman sources. He believed it would allow effects that neither fresco nor his previous oil technique could achieve. He constructed enormous braziers to heat the wall surface and keep the wax pliable as he worked. The experiment failed catastrophically. The heat was insufficient to properly fuse the wax near the top of the massive wall, which rose higher than the braziers could effectively warm. colors began running almost immediately. Leonardo stood in the Hall of the 500 watching his battle scene, intended to immortalize Florentine military glory for centuries, literally melt before his eyes like ice cream in summer sun. He abandoned the project in despair. Michelangelo never finished his section either, called away to Rome by the imperious Pope Julius II to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling. But his cartoon, the full-scale preparatory drawing, survived long enough to influence generations of artists who came to study it. The Battle of Cassina became famous through copies and studies, even though Michelangelo never actually painted the wall itself. Leonardo's Battle of Anghiari had an even stranger fate. For decades after his departure from Florence, his damaged but still visible central section remained on the wall, deteriorating slowly. Artists from across Europe came to copy what they could before it disappeared entirely. Peter Paul Rubens's famous drawing preserves the furious central cavalry clash. Horses biting horses' necks, soldiers grappling desperately over a military standard, faces twisted with battle rage. The violence and dynamism exceeded anything in previous Renaissance art. Then Leonardo's masterpiece vanished entirely. In 1563, Giorgio Vasari was commissioned to renovate the Hall of the 500. He painted new frescoes celebrating Medici glory over the entire room, including the wall where Leonardo's failed experiment had partly survived. For centuries afterward, scholars assumed the original was destroyed during this renovation. But was it? Recent investigations using ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive technologies suggest something tantalizing. Vasari may have built a false wall in front of Leonardo's work, preserving it in an air gap behind his own frescoes. Words painted on Vasari's work, cerca trova, meaning seek and you shall find, hint that he may have left a message for future generations. The evidence remains frustratingly inconclusive. The Florentine government has not permitted full invasive investigation that might confirm or disprove the theory. Leonardo's greatest may still exist, waiting behind a 16th century wall for technology or political will to reveal it. How fitting that his work might literally be hidden by Sfumato's opposite. Hard architectural lines concealing soft, smoky gradations from the eyes of centuries. Through these years of large-scale experimentation and failure, Leonardo continued refining his technique on smaller, more manageable works. He carried the Mona Lisa with him for 16 years, from Florence to Milan to Rome and finally to France. What began as a straightforward portrait commission became something else entirely. A vehicle for demonstrating the ultimate possibilities of Sfumato, pushed beyond anything he had previously achieved. You have seen her face 1,000 times. But have you truly looked at it? Lisa Gherardini, wife of Florentine silk merchant Francesco del Giocondo, sat for Leonardo beginning around 1503. The commission was probably entirely conventional, a portrait to commemorate either the purchase of a new family home or the birth of a son. Such commemorative portraits were common among prosperous Italian merchant families seeking to document their rising status. Leonardo transformed the routine commission into an obsession lasting the rest of his life. The face demonstrates every technique he had developed over 40 years of experimentation. Look carefully at the corners of her mouth. Do you see a smile or not? The ambiguity you experience is entirely intentional, and it is created purely through Sfumato. Leonardo layered paint so thinly that the expression seems to shift subtly as you change your viewing angle or the light in the room changes. Recent scientific analysis revealed something truly remarkable about how he achieved this. Using X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy and other advanced imaging techniques, researchers counted more than 30 distinct layers of translucent paint in some areas of the face. Each layer measured less than 40 micrometers in thickness, thinner than a human hair, thinner than a single sheet of paper. Leonardo applied these impossibly thin glazes over years and years, sometimes waiting months between layers for complete drying and curing. And he used his fingers. Microscopic examination found actual fingerprints embedded in the paint surface. Leonardo apparently smoothed some glazes with his fingertips rather than brushes, physically feeling the paint into the precise gradations he sought. The physical intimacy of this technique staggers imagination. This was not painting as other artists understood it. This was almost sculpting with light and pigment, molding perception itself with bare hands. The landscape behind Lisa demonstrates equally revolutionary technique. Look at the distant mountains on the left side of the painting versus those on the right. They don't match. The horizon lines sit at noticeably different heights. Art historians once assumed this was error or damage. But modern analysis confirms Leonardo deliberately created an impossible landscape. The asymmetry adds to the dreamlike quality. The sense that we are seeing not physical reality, but a vision filtered through consciousness itself. The atmospheric perspective exceeds anything Leonardo had achieved before. Distant forms blur with increasing distance, precisely mimicking how the actual atmosphere affects our real vision. Blues become grayer. Edges soften and dissolve. Leonardo had studied this phenomenon scientifically for decades, filling notebooks with observations about how moisture and particles in air change our perception of faraway objects. The mountains 50 miles distant look different from mountains 5 miles away in very specific, measurable ways. Then he painted exactly what careful observation had taught him. This seamless combination of scientific study and artistic execution defines Leonardo's unique contribution to human culture. He was not painting what he imagined distant mountains should look like based on artistic convention. He was painting what they actually look like to careful human eyes peering through miles of light scattering atmosphere. Can any photograph capture what Sfumato achieves? Consider this seriously for a moment. Photographs freeze a single instant. They record sharp-edged physical reality as it exists at one precise moment in time. The camera captures what is there, objectively, without interpretation or ambiguity. But human perception works profoundly differently. We see movement, change, uncertainty. Our eyes constantly shift focus. Our brains process visual information through multiple layers of interpretation, memory, and expectation. Sfumato captures something much closer to how we actually experience the act of seeing. Leonardo never finished the Mona Lisa to his own perfectionist satisfaction. He carried it to France in 1516, when King Francis I invited him to become first painter and engineer and architect to the king, a title of extraordinary honor for any artist. He installed himself at the Château du Clos-Luce near the royal residence at Amboise. He continued working on the painting whenever his health permitted, until his hands grew too feeble to hold a brush steady. He died in 1519, the Mona Lisa still beside his bed. Francis I purchased it from Leonardo's estate, perhaps from his devoted pupil Salai. It remained in French royal collections for centuries, eventually moving to the Louvre Museum after the Revolution transferred royal property to the nation. For hundreds of years, it was merely one masterpiece among many in that vast collection, admired by artists and connoisseurs, relatively unknown to the general public. Then, in 1911, everything changed. The painting was stolen. A Italian handyman named Vincenzo Perugia hid in the museum overnight, removed the painting from the wall in the morning before the galleries opened, concealed it under his workman's coat, and simply walked out with it. He kept the world's most famous painting in his Paris apartment for more than 2 years before attempting to sell it to an Italian art dealer, motivated partly by nationalist belief that Italian art belonged in Italy. The theft made headlines around the world for weeks. When the Mona Lisa finally returned to the Louvre, crowds lined up to see it for the first time in the museum's history. The painting had transformed from an expert's favorite into a global celebrity, famous for being famous, known to millions who had never visited any museum. Something had fundamentally changed in its cultural status. The painting had become a symbol of art itself, of genius, of mysterious feminine beauty. Andy Warhol would later silkscreen it repeatedly in different colors, exploring how mass reproduction affects our relationship to masterpieces. Critics debated whether the Mona Lisa was overrated, whether its fame obscured its actual artistic quality, whether we could even see it clearly anymore through layers of cultural mythology. But return to the painting itself. Stand before it in the Louvre today, behind its bulletproof glass, in its climate-controlled case, surrounded by tourists raising smartphones to capture an image of an image. Look at that face. The Sfumato technique that Leonardo spent his entire life developing makes this portrait utterly unlike any photograph ever taken. The smile seems alive. The eyes seem to follow you. The expression shifts as you shift. This is not poetic metaphor. This is pure technique. Leonardo understood that sharp lines stop visual movement. Our eyes register defined edges and move on. By eliminating edges entirely. By making every single transition gradual and indefinite. He created a face that our eyes cannot quite resolve into a fixed expression. We keep looking, trying to pin down Lisa's expression once and for all. And it keeps shifting away from certainty. 500 years later, the effect remains as potent as the day he set down his brushes. What does this mean for understanding artistic innovation? Leonardo's Sfumato revolution required several essential elements. Technical mastery built systematically over decades of practice. Scientific observation translated rigorously into artistic technique. Willingness to experiment knowing that failure was likely. And superhuman patience that most people would consider pathological. He worked slowly because the technique absolutely demanded slowness. He left projects unfinished because he pursued a perfection that completion would have betrayed. Modern equivalents might include software developers who delay product launches seeking perfect code, knowing that shipping means accepting imperfection. Musicians who spend years on albums. Writers who revise the same paragraph 100 times. The creative personality type that produces genuine breakthroughs often struggles with practical commercial demands. Leonardo's patrons constantly complained about his missed deadlines and broken contracts. His contemporary Michelangelo openly scorned him for leaving so much unfinished. Yet which works do we remember centuries later? The finished projects of competent craftsmen who delivered on time and budget, or the revolutionary experiments of difficult geniuses who drove everyone around them to distraction? History has answered decisively. Leonardo's surviving paintings number barely 15. Depending on how scholars count disputed attributions and collaborative workshop productions. Michelangelo completed far more finished works, yet the Mona Lisa draws 8 million visitors annually, more than any other artwork anywhere. The Last Supper, despite its ruined state showing perhaps 20% original paint, remains an essential pilgrimage for anyone who cares about art. The Virgin of the Rocks hangs in 2 of the world's greatest museums. And then there is the Salvator Mundi. This painting spent centuries in complete obscurity, its connection to Leonardo forgotten, attributed variously to Leonardo's workshop, to anonymous followers, to nobody in particular. It passed through minor collections and auction houses without attracting serious attention. Then, in 2005, it appeared in an American estate sale. A consortium of art dealers purchased it for around $10,000. They suspected it might be more than anonymous workshop production. They were spectacularly right. After years of painstaking research, cleaning, and forensic analysis, leading experts authenticated it as Leonardo's own work. In November 2017, Christie's auction house in New York sold the Salvator Mundi for $450 million, $300,000, the highest price ever paid for any artwork in human history. A mysterious buyer, later identified as acting for Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, acquired a small wooden panel painted by an artist who died 500 years ago for roughly $500 million. Why would anyone pay that much for this particular painting? The answer involves Sfumato. The Salvator Mundi depicts Christ as Savior of the world, blessing viewers with his raised right hand while holding a crystal orb representing earthly dominion in his left. The face demonstrates Leonardo's unmistakable signature technique: soft atmospheric transitions between light and shadow, ambiguous expression hovering between serenity and sadness, that uncanny aliveness that distinguishes his work from all imitators. The crystal orb itself showcases his deep understanding of optics, how transparent glass distorts and refracts what lies behind it. But authenticity debates continue to roil the art world. Some respected experts argue the painting shows too much workshop involvement to be properly called a Leonardo. Extensive restoration may have replaced too much original paint for certainty about what Leonardo actually painted. The work's poor condition before cleaning means we cannot know what percentage of currently visible brushwork came from the master's own hand. These debates would have fascinated Leonardo himself. He delegated extensively in his workshop. That was standard practice. Assistants prepared wooden panels, mixed paints according to his formulas, and executed less important background passages. The master supervised everything and personally completed crucial areas requiring true sfumato: faces, hands, passages where his signature effects mattered most. Defining exactly where collaboration ends and individual genius begins proves impossible for almost any Renaissance workshop production. Yet the market spoke with overwhelming emphasis. $450 million says the Salvator Mundi possesses something unique that buyers will pay almost anything to own, whether that something resides in physical pigment or historical provenance, in verifiable brushwork or cultural belief. The painting commands attention that anonymous workshop productions never could. Leonardo's name transforms canvas and oil paint and wooden panel into cultural treasure beyond price. What can you take from this story of artistic revolution? Perhaps that genuine innovation requires accepting failure. Leonardo's experimental technique sometimes succeeded brilliantly, producing effects that still astonish 5 centuries later. Sometimes they melted his work off walls or flaked his masterpieces to near ruin within decades of completion. He could not have achieved Sfumato's successes without risking its failures. The two were absolutely inseparable. Perhaps that perfectionism exacts heavy costs. Leonardo completed astonishingly few works because he could not stop refining, could not accept anything less than his evolving vision. Modern creators face the same tension constantly. Ship something imperfect or delay seeking an impossible ideal? Leonardo mostly chose delay. His legacy suggests this choice. However frustrating to patrons and collaborators and practical people, can sometimes produce immortality. Perhaps that seeing differently requires first studying carefully. Leonardo did not invent Sfumato through pure romantic imagination striking like lightning. He observed smoke, mist, shadows, and atmosphere with scientific rigor for decades. He translated those observations into painterly technique through endless practical experimentation. His genius was largely disciplined attention systematically applied over a lifetime. Or perhaps the lesson is simpler still. When Leonardo looked at the world, he saw what others missed: the soft edges, the subtle gradations, the smoke between objects that we ignore because we focus only on objects themselves. He made that invisible atmosphere visible, and in doing so, he changed how humanity understands both art and perception itself. 500 years later, we are still learning to see what he saw. tall-thighed woman behind the glass in the Louvre smiles her infinitely ambiguous smile. The apostles on the damaged wall in Milan react to betrayal with emotions we can read as clearly as our own friends' faces. The Madonna in the rocky grotto sits in geological precision wrapped in dreamlike Sfumato. These images endure because they capture something true. Not the truth of sharp-edged photography, not the truth of outline and filled color, but the truth of how human vision actually works. In gradual transitions, ambiguous readings, atmospheric softness that our conscious minds ignore, but our perceptions depend upon. Leonardo did not paint external reality. He painted perception itself. And perception, it turns out, is what makes art live. The next time you stand before any portrait, consider what Leonardo taught the world. Notice how light falls across a face. Notice where shadow begins. Or rather, notice that you cannot define exactly where it begins. Notice how your eyes move restlessly, seeking resolution, finding only ambiguity that keeps pulling you back. That ambiguity is not failure. It is sfumato. It is smoke, breath, atmosphere, the invisible substance that separates everything from everything else. Leonardo saw it clearly. He learned to paint it precisely. He spent his entire life perfecting techniques to capture what had always existed but never been rendered on any surface. In doing so, he did not just create paintings. He taught the world to see. The mist still rises from Tuscan valleys at dawn. Hills still blur softly into sky. And somewhere in Paris, behind bulletproof glass, a woman smiles at 8 million visitors per year, her expression shifting with each viewing angle, her secret kept for 500 years and counting. Leonardo would have appreciated the endless mystery. He knew that some things are not meant to be fully resolved. The power of sfumato lies precisely in its refusal to define edges. The power of great art lies in the questions it refuses to answer. The Mona Lisa's smile means nothing specific, and therefore means everything you need it to mean. This is the sfumato revolution. Not just a technique for blending paint on wooden panels, a way of seeing that embraces ambiguity, that values gradation over definition, that understands the air between things as important as the things themselves. Leonardo discovered it watching smoke curl from candles in a Florentine workshop when he was barely more than a teenager. When we are still discovering it today. And every time someone stands before his surviving works, the 15 odd paintings that represent his entire artistic output, the hundreds of millions of dollars they command at auction, the centuries of influence they have exerted on every visual medium that followed. They participate in his revolution. They see the smoke. They understand, perhaps just for a moment, that the world has no hard edges. And they look again at the woman who has watched humanity watching her for 500 years. Her smile still shifting, still ambiguous, still mysteriously alive. That is what Leonardo gave us. That is why it still matters. That is the revolution that one painter with patience and vision achieved. One thin, translucent layer at a time, building towards something no one before him had imagined possible. Smoke and light, shadow and face, art that breathes. Leonardo da Vinci changed how we see. We are still learning to look,